For years I've been using and highly recommending this saw blade for veneered plywood, such as birch and oak, and for making delicate crosscuts, such as miters. Just a few days ago, it was in a video about 3 essential saw blades that will transform how even an old table saw cuts. I'll link to that video below this one if you want to watch it. But after watching that video, one viewer insisted that that blade is unsafe for the table saw because the teeth are angled slightly backward in what is called a negative hook or rake. He reasoned that blades with a negative hook angle are designed for miter saws and radial arm saws only, which position the blade on top of the workpiece rather than below it as a table saw does. He reasoned that the purpose of a negative hook angle is to push the workpiece downward, keeping it on the table of your miter saw. And if you reversed everything by mounting that same blade in the table saw with the workpiece now on top, that same negative hook angle would lift the workpiece upward and potentially kick it back at you. You see this argument occasionally on message boards, usually in theoretical discussions by well-meaning folks who have never actually experienced a kickback from a negative hook blade on a table saw. It just seems to make sense in theory, so they'll debate it all day long if you disagree. However, if you've been around woodworking long, you know that theory doesn't always match reality. So let's look at the reality of the issue. What is a negative hook used for? Does it push the workpiece downward on a miter saw and lift it upward on a table saw? Are all negative hooks equally beneficial or dangerous? Why use one on the table saw at all? First, let's establish one simple fact. Using a blade with a negative hook on a table saw is not a new concept. It's factually inaccurate to say they're not designed for table saw use. Several manufacturers, including many of the top brands, make blades with negative hook angles for the table saw. Here's one on Bosch's website. It has a negative hook and they specifically list table saws among its recommended uses. Here's another from Amana that's sold for table saw use. Here's one from Freud, again for table saws. We could go on and on. So let's just dispense with the notion that negative hook blades are not intended for table saw use. Now, why would you use a negative hook blade on the table saw? Put simply, to produce a less aggressive cutting action. On some saw blades, the teeth are angled forward, as much as 20 degrees on heavy-duty rip blades. Forward hook teeth strike the wood at a very aggressive angle that increases the speed of the cut by pulling the wood toward the blade, or at least offering less resistance, especially when combined with a low tooth count and large gullets between the teeth to clear that dust away, such as on a 24-tooth rip blade. But that aggressive hook angle wouldn't work well on a blade with more teeth and smaller gullets to clear the dust. For example, if this 40-tooth combination blade featured that same 20-degree positive hook, the feed rate might overwhelm the ability of those smaller gullets to clear the dust, and you would build up heat and vibrations and end up with a poor cut. So this blade features a less aggressive 15-degree positive hook. And this 80-tooth crosscut blade with even smaller gullets to clear even less dust features an even less aggressive hook angle. Now, if you're freaking out because I said an aggressive forward hook will pull the wood toward the blade, fear not. It doesn't suck the board in. You still have to use force to push it through the cut. It'll just cut a little easier, making the job a little faster, so you build up less heat and get a cleaner cut. A positive hook does not make the blade more dangerous, at least not at the table saw. We'll talk about radial arm saws and miter saws shortly. My point is, at the table saw, the hook angle, be it aggressively positive or even slightly negative, should be customized to the blade itself and its intended purpose. That's often one of the differences between premium blades and inexpensive ones. And it's not just about feed rates. A less aggressive hook will also produce less chip out on the bottom of your workpiece. That's why table saw blades made specifically for cutting plywood or laminates or melamine typically feature a negative hook angle. They'll produce a cleaner cut on those chip out prone materials. It's why I like that 80-tooth blade in particular with its slightly negative hook of 5 degrees. But what about miter saws? Isn't it beneficial to have a negative hook blade on a miter saw or a radial arm saw for safety purposes? Absolutely. Here we have a blade with an aggressive positive hook, positioned above a workpiece as it would be on a miter saw or a radial arm saw. Notice how the teeth enter the wood at a very steep angle, almost dragging across the surface. This is going to greatly increase the feed, pulling the board hard against the fence and potentially pulling the saw itself over the top of the board and toward the operator. A blade with a negative hook angle attacks the wood less aggressively. The blade can still climb on top if you aren't careful, but such a dangerous situation will be much easier to prevent at this shallower cutting angle. Now notice something else. Both blades are contacting the wood at a downward angle. The positive hook does pull more toward the fence, but both are pushing downward. I point this out because some argue that a negative hook blade is intended to push your stock down on top of the table when it's used on a miter saw or a radial arm saw, and so it would naturally lift the workpiece up when the orientation of the blade is reversed, such as at a table saw. But is this the case? No matter the hook angle, both blades push downward on the miter saw. And at the table saw, with the workpiece on top, the cutting action of this 5-degree negative hook blade is still at a slightly downward angle. These three teeth are the ones doing the cutting. None of them are lifting the workpiece upward. Is it pushing the wood forward though? Yes, most saw blades push the wood forward. That's why you have to use force to push the wood back through the cut. Can the forward force that the teeth of the blade exert kick the wood back at you? While you could argue that a negative hook tooth does strike the wood with more blunt force than a positive hook tooth, the greater danger is the size of the bite each tooth takes. Aggressive blades with few teeth, such as that 24-tooth rip blade, can take a big bite because the gullets allow it. The positive hook angle of these teeth help counteract that by adding some pulling force, as we discussed before, but I've still never seen a 24-tooth blade with a negative hook, and if I did, I probably would think twice about using it on a table saw. Negative hook teeth, though, are typically found on crosscut blades with many teeth and small gullets. These take tiny bites, which greatly reduce that forward force that they exert, even with a negative rake angle. This is where theory falls before actual practice. I can push a workpiece through an 80-tooth blade with a 5-degree negative hook with very little force. As long as I use a splitter or a riving knife, as you should with every cut, no matter the blade, there's no greater risk of kickback just because of the negative hook angle. If you'd like to learn more about how table saw kickback actually occurs, I'll place a link to a video below this one about it. There's another important thing going on here that you should take note of. This blade is set with a full tooth face emerging from the top of the board. That's the minimal recommended height when making through cuts. Some set their blades slightly higher with maybe half the gullet emerging as well. But somewhere in that range is what manufacturers recommend. Why? Well, notice what happens when you raise the blade height. The angle at which the teeth contacts the wood changes. That might increase the self-feed rate just enough to cause excess dust to build up in the kerf and reduce the cut quality. It will definitely increase the chip out on the bottom side, and it's going to reduce the benefits that the manufacturer designed into the blade. That's why it's always best to keep your blade height somewhere between a full tooth or maybe half the gullet emerging above the workpiece. That's not just to protect yourself from getting cut by all the teeth emerging above the wood. Your blade guard should take care of that. It's because the blade was designed to be used at that height, and changing it will change the function of the blade and potentially reduce its benefits. So, what's the bottom line on negative hook blades? Manufacturers sell them specifically for miter and radial arm saw use and for table saw use as well. They're designed with a specific purpose. On a miter or radial arm saw, they reduce the chance of climbing and make the cut easier to control and therefore safer. On a table saw, they can reduce chip out, especially in veneered plywood and laminates. I use and recommend an 80-tooth blade with a negative 5-degree hook for table saw cuts in veneered plywood and for fine cross cuts in solid wood, both at the table saw and on the miter saw. I've spoken directly to the manufacturer and they recommend it for that purpose as well. If your blade says do not use with a table saw, don't do it. But don't assume all negative hook blades are the same and that none should be used with a table saw. Don't forget to check out the other table saw related videos below this one. There's a lot to learn. See you next time. Ridge Carbide is the best kept secret in woodworking. I kid you not, their saw blades are second to none. both in quality and performance, and they're less expensive than the other ultra-premium brands. Do yourself a favor, use the link and the discount code below this video. You will never go back to cheap blades again. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.